Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to this conversation about the mesmeric Bob Dylan. My name is Anne Marie Bassich, and I am the curator of the Bob Dylan exhibit that you can see on the 5th floor here on display. I'm also a high school teacher and have been an educator for about 20 years. This conversation really today is meant to be a complement to the exhibit. In which we're exploring what is this something that draws people into the work and the art of Bob Dylan and the man of Bob Dylan. We've invited here today two professors who I'm full of gratitude that you accepted our invitation, and they're both wise and accomplished in their own fields, and one really, I would say, is an official Dylanologist. And they have deep appreciation for Bob Dylan, the man and his music. First, we have Richard Thomas, who is the George Martin Lane Professor of Classics at Harvard University. He was educated at the University of Auckland and the University of Michigan. His teaching and research interests are focused on Hellenistic Greek and Roman literature and the works of Bob Dylan. It's true. He's actually taught in the classics department for the past 12 years one of the most popular seminars on Bob Dylan and his music. So I'm serious when I say that. His publications include more than 100 articles and reviews and several books, the last one being 2017's Why Dylan Matters, which is also actually on sale here, and there'll be a book signing it right after this. And then we have Professor Robert George, and he is a McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He is the Chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom and previously served on the President's Council on Bioethics and as Presidential Appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. A graduate of Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School, Professor George also earned a master's degree in theology from Harvard and a doctorate in philosophy of law from Oxford University. Author of several books and innumerable articles, he holds honorary doctorates in law, literature, science, and ethics. And you can learn more about both of them in our program. Arguably, Bob Dylan is the most influential singer-songwriter in rock and roll history, which isn't a long history. He marked a turning point for rock and roll, both musically and lyrically, and is the winner of the 2016 Nobel Prize in Literature. Dylan writes songs that are at once personal and universal, weaving tales simultaneously indecipherable and revelatory, turning a spotlight on the mystery of the human soul through glimpses of his own. Dylan taps into something and manages to express it, not only through his lyrics and music, but through the personas that he embodies in his performances. And he is still performing today at 77 or 78 years of age. What music critic Tom Moon wrote of Dylan's latest album that came out during the process of this exhibit, More Tracks from Blood on the Tracks, and actually quoting Dylan's own words, he says, "He conjures the corkscrew to the heart, then finds ways to turn it further. He's translating the messy and mysterious into music with universal resonance." And that is true for much of his work. So something is happening here in the work of Bob Dylan, and we hope to shed some light on that and go a little deeper into it through this conversation this afternoon. I'd like to start with a question for you, Richard, and actually for Robert as well. Every diehard Dylan fan, including myself, remembers what first drew him or her to his music. Perhaps it was a particular album. I remember the song and the moment that I knew I needed to explore more. Can you share with us how you first came to know and be interested in Bob Dylan and his music?
Sure. Well, I first became interested through Blowin' in the Wind, but not sung by Bob Dylan, like many in the mid-60s, I'm 9 years younger than Dylan, so that makes me 77 minus 9. So we sang the Peter, Paul, and Mary version at a school choir when I was 13 or 14. And then eventually, as with the Byrds, one heard Tambourine Man, Mr. Tambourine Man before, maybe you heard Dylan on the radio. So that was the first experience. And then most memorable was a couple of years later, I guess, with in '66 with Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowland. For a very good friend of my older brother had a girlfriend who dumped him, and he was very obsessed with that song, and so I got to hear it vicariously, and enjoyed it, all 11 plus minutes of it. So yeah, it's a gradual process, but those are the two moments that I remember earliest, and then it's over the years, it's been just an iteration of that process. So.
Thank you.
Well, first I want to say just how delighted I am to be here and how grateful I am for the invitation, not only to be on this panel to discuss something I'm really interested in, Dylan's music, but also to be at the meeting. This is the first time for me at the New York encounter. I've been to the wonderful meeting in Rimini, but frankly, I didn't know about the New York encounter, and I'm really pleased to know about it and delighted to be here.
Took Bob.
And it's such an honor to be on the panel with somebody who's a genuine Dylan expert. I just like the music. Richard knows what he's talking about, so I'm hoping that this will mostly be a conversation with Richard. But I can tell you a little bit about my first falling in love with Dylan's music. I'm a little younger, not a lot, but a little younger than Richard, so I don't quite remember firsthand the Blowin' in the Wind, Times There a Change in iteration, much less the earlier folk stuff from the Newport Festival, for example. When it was '63, I guess, the first time, roughly. Yeah. Do I have that right? So, although I've since gone back and looked at YouTubes and so forth, but I got interested in Dylan in the late '60s when he put out Nashville Skyline Rag. By that time, I grew up in West Virginia. I was born and brought up in West Virginia. I was interested in country music. By that time, I was playing guitar and starting to play banjo. And this figure, Dylan, who was from a school of music, rock and roll, that I had very little interest in, had suddenly put out a really interesting country album that even had Johnny Cash on it. So wow, I got really fascinated with that. And that got me interested in Dylan himself. And then I went back and discovered the wonderful stuff from earlier in the 1960s and even the late 1950s that I've since learned to love and have performed a great deal of myself. So it was really the country iteration of Dylan that brought me through the door.
I should just add, when I got my first girlfriend, Lay Lady Lay was also...
My mother didn't like that.
And that was where we heard that Dylan could sing in any style, really, as well. It's interesting, though, I think one of the things that people who really, as Joan Baez said, when Dylan touches somebody in a particular way, he really goes deep. So what I found interesting in doing this work and in talking with other Dylan aficionados is that something that I was reminded of in one of the talks earlier today on education, where the president of Trinity Schools was talking about wonder and this experience that for the Greeks, wonder was almost like a puzzlement in front of something interesting that drew you in and made you understand you had to learn more. And what I find interesting in Dylan's work and his music, and it draws you in if you're serious with him in the way that he's serious with his work. And it doesn't disappoint the farther in you go. And I was wondering if you could speak to what is it about Dylan and his work that draws so many people in and then doesn't disappoint.
Right. Well, it happens with the political songs, the civil rights, anti-war songs, that he happens to be a genius, and the one mark of a genius is to be able to do what we can't do, but to create something that is meaningful to us as human beings. So that Todd Gitlin said, as Dylan, of course, tried to lose the protest singer sort of label, that Gitlin said, Dylan wrote our songs for us, whether he liked it or not, he produced our songs for us. And I think that's true for every genre, every theme that Dylan, through his songwriting, and not just through his songwriting, through his performance, through the look of him, through the voice, basically touches our souls in any number of ways, because he can write the songs that we can't write, but that are utterly meaningful in every complex way in which it is to be a human being. So I could go into any number of, I think I have to give my favorite song later, which I'm not going to do, but
that's our last question.
yeah, so take the last 20 years. I mean, the songs that since 1997 that he's produced, which are the songs not of a young man. He's not up there like Mick with leather pants on, singing songs of a 19 or 20-year-old. He's singing the songs which are still about love, lovesick, and so on. The condition is still there, the unavoidable condition, the attempt to escape, but the fact that one is drawn back in through memory, through the pain of an experience that mattered that is no longer there, but it's there in your mind. So, and I think particularly the older, wiser Dylan, he's always been wise, but the Dylan of these years, if you stop listening at Newport 65, or you stop listening in 79, as I did, I was not a person of faith then, and so felt betrayed. I came back to him, and I do have faith. But if you stop listening to him, start in 97 and just listen to the music that he's produced. It's absolutely astonishing. I think Tempest is as good an album as Blonde on Blonde, the one album I brought with me from New Zealand, one Dylan album. So,
thank you.
Well, he's certainly capable of provoking or eliciting powerful reactions from people. The best evidence for that is Joan Baez's Diamonds and Rust. Toxic masculinity has never been as powerfully indicted as it was by Baez in that song, which of course is about Dylan's mistreatment of her. And it's really a great song. And Joan Baez is not a great songwriter. She's a wonderful singer, but even if in an unfortunate manner, elicited from her that really powerful song. The other thing I think that draws people in, Americans, but also others who are not interested, or who are not Americans but who are interested in America, is the Americanness of Bob Dylan. He couldn't be anything else. He couldn't be French or Chinese or Saudi or Brazilian. He's distinctively American. There's a kind of rootlessness that's still searching for roots, a desire to be rooted, but not too rooted, a desire to be able to create and recreate yourself, but not to be entirely alien, not to be entirely detached. And Dylan has created and recreated himself. And I think, although I'll defer to Richard on this, I think that's more than simply creating and recreating personae. I think it's actually real. I think he has experienced transformations. Now, there are also the masks. We all know about the masks, that's for sure. But I think there are also these transformations. I think in the American psyche, there's a tension and a drama about whether we create ourselves or discover our true selves. So when we go on the quest, is the quest to discover the real me or the real us or the real America? Or is it a quest of self-creation, to decide just for ourselves, for our own reasons or for no reasons at all, that we want to be this or that or the other thing? In my judgment, for what it's worth, I think Dylan comes out consistently on the side of self-discovery more than self-creation, although he's been through these various transformations. But I think there's something very American about that. And then my final point on this is, I think not only could he be nothing other than American, it's also important that Dylan is from the periphery. In a way, from the heartland. We say, well, how can he be the periphery? He's the heartland, Minnesota. But he's from the periphery. He's a major force in American culture, and certainly in American elite culture, but he's not from the elite culture. He's growing up in the 40s, I guess, and 50s. He's starting to do music in the 50s. This is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American. He's a Jewish kid. And he's not from New York, or he's not from LA, and he's not from a city, and his background is not Ivy League. And he's this amazing person from the hinterlands, but very American in that.
Thank you. In fact, it was a perfect segue, and I was going to ask about this question of his quintessential Americanness. And it's interesting when you watch videos of him during the height of his fame in the mid-'60s and in Europe, and people would ask him about his songs, and he'd say, "Are you American?" Because they didn't understand, and he'd say, "This is American music. Are you American?" So he had this clear perception of that. And I'm also tempted to talk about that Joan Baez song, which from a woman's perspective, I would have never characterized in the way you did as toxic masculinity, but I won't. I digress. But in fact, she still says that he's the most brilliant, crazy person she's ever known. So she still has a great affection for Bob Dylan.
Well, if I can just follow up on that. So one of the lines in Diamonds and Rust, for those of you who know it, is he's calling from the phone booth in the Midwest, where I think he's actually reading her the lyrics of Lily Rosemary and the Jack of Hearts. He hasn't been in touch. I think this is right. They haven't been in touch in a long time. He calls her from a phone booth somewhere in the Midwest. He reads her the lyrics to this new song that he's written. He's obviously very pleased with himself about. But one of the things that Baez reports in the song is, "My poetry is lousy," you said. So one of the ways that he offended or hurt her was by telling her, perhaps truthfully, that her poetry is lousy. But actually, her poetry in Diamonds and Rust is pretty good.
Yes, absolutely.
Also, you who are so good with words, I mean, I think she captures Dylan, the songwriter, there. Of course, I think it's in Rolling Thunder that he suggested that she play the song, and she said, she played a Dylan on him. She said, "Oh, that wasn't to you, that was about someone else."
But actually, it's very interesting that we're talking about this, because one of the things about Dylan, he says, all of my work is autobiographical. And yet at the same time, especially his early stuff and things through Blood on the Tracks, there's a sort of veiled eye, poetic eye in there. And this brings me to the question, we just spoke about his quintessential Americanness, but it's also clear that he has an incredible international appeal. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which was pretty controversial in 2016. And I wanted to ask you in particular, Richard, many people were surprised by the choice. In fact, people in the establishment some were disgruntled that this singer-songwriter who had sort of stolen the poet's laurels when he was a kid, now is getting the prize in 2016. Although I read that also Allen Ginsberg had been had been suggesting him for years. But I'd like you to speak as a professor of literature and classics. Why do you think it's such a controversial choice, and why do you think it makes sense in the context of world literature and classical literature that he won the prize?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the Americanness, but the Americanness is appreciated in Japan, where he's very popular, by people who don't know a word of English. They turn up, and that's again the look, the voice, the music, the sound, the lyrics to some extent. So, yeah, the Nobel. Yeah, I was one of the people who had been pushing for it for years. A friend of mine, Robert Ball, has written about putting up Bob for the Nobel for years, and I think eventually the committee heard and saw what was involved with Dylan. Maybe some of them were Dylan fans too. And Dylan is up there for me with Virgil and Homer and Ovid, the poets whom he's been channeling since 2001, Love and Theft, starting with Virgil. And so why do I teach him? I think he's a classic in the same way that they're classics. I don't know if they'll be around in 200 years, the way this world and this country are headed. I'm an American citizen, by the way, so I can say that. But if anybody's listened to, if anybody's song is listened to, and if song still exists, and song exists before literature, Bob Dylan will still be around in the same way that those poets are around. And he'll be around because his song, again, basically touches what it means to be a human being. And as Dylan himself said of Thucydides in Chronicles, where he claims he read Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, that Thucydides notes that human nature doesn't change, and so experience doesn't change, therefore the expression, the artistic and creative capturing of what it means to be human will remain constant. So I think the medal for the Nobel, I wrote about this a bit in the book, the medal, 1901 to 1902, has a young man sitting under a tree with a box for his papyrus rolls, so it's an allusion to Virgil's first eclogue, the first pastoral poetry really in the West, at least in Latin, ends up with Seamus Heaney's pastoral. So this young man sitting there, he's got a piece of paper on his knee and a pen, a stylus, a Roman pen, and he's looking up, and to the left, standing in front of him, is a muse who's playing a guitar. The word kithara is the same word as guitar. It's the ancient word for lyre. It's a 7-stringed lyre. So the definition of the Nobel Prize for Literature on the medal that it has existed for 116 years, on that medal there is a person who is Bob Dylan is closer to that person than any other Nobel awardee, including Eliot and Yeats and the rest of them. So song and poetry come together. So just a final point, the Swedish Academy, Sarah Danius, said, well, Sappho was sung in antiquity, we've lost the music, but we can still read Sappho as poetry. And Dylan actually contradicted that in his June 2017 Nobel lecture, where he starts talking about song at the end. He has this wonderful story from the Odyssey of Odysseus meeting the shade of Achilles in the underworld. And Achilles and Odysseus, or Dylan says, he met Achilles, and Achilles said, I just died, that's all. It wasn't about fame. And then he makes a transition to talking about song. My songs are in the land of the living, is what he says. And then he says, my songs have to be sung, they can't be read. So he, in the speech accepting the Nobel Prize for Literature, he contradicted the head of the Academy that awarded it to him. And that's the integrity. It's amusing in a way, but that's the integrity of Bob Dylan, the artist. He was happy to get the Nobel, but he was not going to allow his art to be redefined into something it isn't, namely words without music, and performance, I would add. So that, again, is just the courage, the honesty of Dylan, who's known where he's going. He knew 3 or 4 years before the rest of us at various stages in his career. So yeah, he deserves it.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know nearly as much as Richard does, so I was caught by surprise. I didn't know anyone, I didn't know anyone was pushing for this, so I was just one of those people who was stunned that he got the Nobel Prize. I just didn't think the Nobel Prize went to people like Bob Dylan. On the other hand,
it just goes to Bob Dylan.
To Bob Dylan, yeah, because there are no
There's
people
one
like Bob Dylan. But what did not surprise me a bit, in fact, I would have been surprised had anything other than this happened, was that he didn't show up to get it. That was completely unsurprising for me. I didn't think that he would. Richard pointed out at lunch that he had to give the lecture in order to collect the $990,000. So it's not surprising that he gave the lecture, but I wasn't surprised that he didn't show up for it. Just another point, I'd be curious to hear, Richard, this is really a question for you, Richard. So a lot of the music over time, lots of different themes, but two themes that I find running through a lot of the music in the different periods, the Christian period, the country period, the rock and roll period, the folk period. Two themes are freedom or liberation and belonging. Freedom and belonging. And those two are also often in tension. When we belong, we need to conform, we need to be with the group, there are norms, there are rules, and then we long for freedom. But then freedom can also be self-alienating. We need a sense of belonging, being part of something, again, being rooted. A lot of people thought of Dylan early on and continue to think of him as a protest singer, and he always says, I'm not that, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not a protest singer. So even his liberation songs are not easily classified or comprehensively classified as protest songs. But am I right that these themes run through his music?
Sure, yeah, I mean, because they're two very important aspects of being a human being. I mean, he wrote the best civil rights song and the best anti-war song that have been written. And so it's the songs that he produced through his genius that allow us to get close to those feelings about freedom, about belonging. Did Bob Dylan oppose the Vietnam War? I imagine he probably did, but he wasn't on tour from 66 to 74 when it was really heating up. He wasn't in Chicago in 68 or Paris 68. So I just don't know. And he's also said, aren't all of my songs protest songs? Mm-hmm. And in a sense, they are protest about the unfair things that happen in life, including unjust wars. I mean, he's done things like sing Masters of War as we were about to bomb Iraq in Australia and New Zealand leading up to that event in early 2003. The minute we went in, he stopped singing it. It disappeared from the set lists because I think he didn't want to be labeled by singing it as the bombs were falling, but my guess is that he was singing it because he was probably willing, as many of us were, that not happen. So, yeah, I think it's the songwriting. I've been to the Tulsa Archive 4 times, and you see in the archive just how much care he's putting into his songs. So there are songs there that have a bridge that's finished and have the first line that's finished, but the structure of the song and the meaning of the song and the meanings of the song are not yet there. So they come gradually through the hard work that Dylan as an artist he said he did Blowin' in the Wind in 10 minutes. Look at the structure of that song. I mean, that's an incredibly artful song. He may have done bits of it or the idea of it or the use of the melody, but Dylan is a very unreliable narrator, as we all know, and so all we have are the songs, and Dylan has made sure that all we have are the songs, and again, the performance of it by Dylan. And so I don't actually, I won't say I don't care what Bob Dylan thinks. I do. I love Bob Dylan, but it's the songs that he produces and the effects that those songs have on us. Again, that to me is as far as I can sort of go into it in a way. Now, just to finish on the Nobel, so the Nobel, which ends with Odysseus, the lecture, that is the June 2017. Look at it on YouTube if you can. It has this great jazz, Steve Allen sort of jazz piano in the background. Mm-hmm. It's just, I mean, I think he says it all there when he talks most openly about his art. It starts with Buddy Holly, who he saw in Duluth 3 days before the plane went down, and then he talks about Lead Belly, and then he talks in this wonderful metaphor of on the same label Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee and Gene Ritchie, and so he got into folk music and he inhabited the vernacular of folk music, which he has always and from the beginning, and of course it's come back in some of his later art with blues, gospel, and so on. Listen to him doing Barbara Allen at the Gaslight, and Barbara Allen is a song that goes back to Samuel Pepys in the 17th century knew it, and it was already an old song. So song dies out because it's not written down until people like Child come and write down the ballads, and the Lomaxes start recording. But this folk tradition, it's there in antiquity. There are lullabies, Held at a ma brefa ah, Held at a ma brefa ah, Sleep My Little Baby, which get embedded into a poem by the poet Theocritus. But normally high culture tries to eradicate low culture and the folk music because it's not part of the educational system of elites. But Bob Dylan has existed throughout time. There's not been anyone like him. I wouldn't just say in the last 50 years. I don't think there's been a writer of songs specifically, that has ever existed. In Greek antiquity, there were kithara players, guitar players who went around the Mediterranean. Whole towns emptied out to see them play. They had ornate costumes, ornate instruments. None of their song survives because it was oral, but on vases, go look at the Met, there's a wonderful, beautiful vase of a kithara player. I mean, that would have been a rock star of antiquity, but high culture, the alphabet isn't invented to preserve that culture, but it's timeless.
I'd like to touch on something that both of you have, we've spoken here about the human experience and how Bob Dylan is able to really tap into that through his art. I'd like to approach really the religious question. I mean, from the very early on in Dylan, the human person as a religious being and as someone who seeks to understand what this life is about, and in a sense approach the mystery of life. And what I discovered in researching Dylan was his perception of himself on a journey, and also the perception of himself as having been given a gift. And he talks about this from as early on as, an interview when he was 23 years old till an interview in 2012, that he perceived himself as having a calling, and that this was his gift, the music, the gift of being an artist. But also explicitly we know, although Dylan purposefully tries to leave us only with his music, he also endorses books like the Essential Interviews, in which there are quite a few interviews where he explicitly talks about his Christianity and his conversion, and especially his fascination with the person of Christ. And then he has 3 albums that are confessional albums, the 3 gospel albums. And some critics talk about that as having been a phase. But I'd like, if you would both of you speak about his religiosity and that, in particular, that experience of his conversion, if you would, and how that's continued or changed since the late 70s.
Okay.
Well, one of the most insightful things I've ever heard anybody say about Donald Trump is that Trump's critics made the mistake of taking him literally but not seriously. To understand him, you have to take him seriously but not literally. And there's a sense in which that's true of Bob Dylan as well. He tells a lot of, for want of a better word, fibs, especially about himself and his own history and his own background and what's going on inside his head. But I'm using the word fib rather than lie, and maybe even fib is too strong a word, because I have a sense that to understand him, especially on the religious question, but not exclusively, especially on the religious question, you can't take him necessarily literally, but you have to take him seriously because he's serious about it. Richard can confirm whether this is true. He says at one point in one of his reflections about his own biography that he attended a Billy Graham rally, and he found it absolutely exhilarating because Billy Graham was not only a mesmerizing preacher, but he was saving souls. And Dylan makes clear, at least to the extent that you can take him literally, that he didn't mean anything sarcastic by saving souls, and he didn't mean saving souls in some figurative sense. He meant saving people's souls. And my sense is that what he's talking about here, about attending that rally and having that experience and forming that judgment, was before his formal conversion and before the the period of the religious music, the three gospel albums. So my sense is that he was serious about religion, and not just the abstract meaning of life stuff. I mean dogmatic faith and the question of whether those dogmas are true. Is Jesus Christ the Son of God? Did he die on a cross for the redemption of mankind and the forgiveness of sins? He's dealing with those questions and wrestling with those questions and having something that I think could only be described as religious experiences, such as at the Billy Graham rally, if it actually happened, and I'd like Richard to tell us whether it did. But even if it didn't, if it's one of these fibs that he's telling, it's got to be taken seriously, even if you can't take it literally. He's wrestling with those questions of faith, those concrete, specific, who is Jesus Christ type questions of faith. So was he at the Billy Graham rally?
Yeah. But he was also bar mitzvahed at the Androy Hotel in Hibbing, Minnesota, which is, go to Hibbing if you haven't been there. Go to Duluth also, both places. Yeah. So the fight for the soul of Bob Dylan, is he Jewish? Is he Christian? He's Jewish. He's never not been. I have a friend who's a rabbi around Minnesota who knows where Dylan went for some years, but he had a conversion experience. At one point, I thought the 79 to 81 thing might have just been a new persona. I think the Christian persona, existed before that and throughout. So he draws from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. He, of course, in Shelter from the Storm, he is Christ. In a little hilltop village, they gambled for my clothes. So that may seem shocking, but the I there is that figure, and the audacity of Dylan is willing to do that. That might seem like irreverence. I don't think it is. I think it's part of just the profound lyric making again of Dylan. So you take an album like take the songs Cold Irons Bound. I went to church on Sunday as she passed by, but then the song Not Dark Yet. I was born here and I'll die here against my choice. Daniel and Kabbalistic writings, but those are two songs on the same album, but they're songs that are drawing from the faith liturgies of both of those religions. I don't think, unlike Leonard Cohen, I don't think he's dabbled much in Eastern literature, but I assume he's a man of faith, just because I don't think he could write the songs that he has written, but I think trying to pin him down, oh, look, he went to Jerusalem, he must have come back, and of course there was a natural desire to get Dylan back to his Jewishness. But for those months, and it's really a slow train, Coming is the one that has strongly Christian, undeniably Christian song. But take a song like Every Grain of Sand. Every Grain of Sand doesn't mention Jesus, but God cares about every grain of sand, and that anybody of any religion can get a faith experience by listening to the poetry of that song. And so I think that's what Dylan, apart from those few years, Dylan is doing. And then the voices that he's created in some of the more recent things. So the captain on the Titanic in the Tempest, he read the book of Revelation, then he filled his cup with tears. Fantastic lines again, and in the voice of Dylan. So that's talking around the issue a bit, but I think he knows what his faith is. I doubt that many other people know, and I think it's complex and it embraces a great deal, including the Christianity which he learned about, went to Sunday school in those months.
Evidently in his performances, even his recent performances, he still does some of the gospel numbers. And I was just actually reading before coming here today, just trying to bone up a bit for this discussion, that after one of those performances that included a gospel number, someone commented on the way he sang the gospel number, saying to him, you sang that like a true believer. And he responded by saying, I am a true believer. But then going way back, when someone in the crowd hollered Judas at him, Was that when he went electric? Is that
Yes.
when the Judas?
Well, he'd gone, that was in England, where he was doing acoustic first halves and electric second halves, and the fans in England, you can see it in Scorsese's documentary, the fans from '65 just were blown away because the Dylan, who had just, again, reached them at their most core, essential beings, were disappointed. And of course, Dylan knew that he was born to play with a band with electric as well as acoustic instruments. He knew that, and they made that transition, and eventually people caught up with him. There's discussion about how much booing there was. Seeger claims he didn't try to cut the cables, it's just that the sound was terrible and so on. And that may be true, but yeah, I mean, if you were going to hear acoustic Mr. Tambourine Man and you hear Mike Bloomfield's sort of electric guitar howling out into the night, something had happened here, right? So.
Well, someone hollered out Judas.
Oh yeah. So Judas.
And then later, when he was asked, well, why did that upset you so much? I mean, why didn't you just let that roll like water off a duck's back? And he responded by saying, because he accused me of being the person who betrayed our Savior.
That was
he
in
did.
2012.
But is that tongue-in-cheek, our Savior? That's a lot later.
Take him seriously, but not literally.
No.
But with the Judas, of course, as many of you know, so the Judas comes out of the dark, and Dylan, that's Dylan, who's probably pretty badly drugged up at this point. The motorcycle accident happened a bit later, and he withdrew. But what he said was, "I don't believe you. You're a liar." And then he turns to Robbie Robertson and says, "Play fucking loud." But then he comes around and he just basically, this gesture of the guitar for the opening note of Like a Rolling Stone is just Todd Hayes' I'm Not There has that scene. The Machine Guns, I think, are sort of picking up on that Dylan, this is what I give you back for calling me that. So in performance, he gave the answer right there.
And some of these references to these iconic performances you can see actually at the exhibit in the video, including this scene he's talking about. But to close our conversation, but not our moment, because we're going to have some music, some live music from Robert George and in just a little bit. But can you speak to us each about your favorite Dylan song and why? Just to finish. We've got about 3 minutes.
It depends. It was one thing 2 hours ago. It's another thing now. So it's whatever I'm listening to on my iPod. I need an iPod because I have lots of songs. I'm not sure where they came from. So Visions of Johanna is probably the poetic song that most touches me. Every Grain of Sand, Not Dark Yet, so across the whole range. But it depends on, so at the Beacon, I came down for one of the Beacon shows in December, and so there, Scarlet Town, this beautiful version of Scarlet Town, completely unlike the studio version, but that, for that moment and for days afterwards, was my favorite Dylan song. So it's partly recalling him in performance. There are Dylan songs that are not good songs, but there are too many for me to be able to say, well, Mississippi, that's up there too. But, and then, I mean, that's the problem. You keep going. But it's whatever in my mind from a performed presentation of it. Normally not. I don't listen to studio versions so much. And More Blood, More Tracks. If you haven't gotten that,
Wonderful.
Get it. It's amazing. You see over these 3 days in the New York sessions, just how these songs, they were all in his head as he came into the studio. But they're changing slightly the lyrics, but the arrangements going from just him and acoustic guitar the first day, then the Deliverance band, and then realizing he only wanted the bass player in a course of 3 days. That was, and I'll stop because...
Well, I was glad that you went on for a bit because I was rolling around my mind trying to think of what my favorite Dylan song is, and it is very hard, and I'm not going to be able to come up with an answer, I'm afraid, Anne-Marie. But there are at least three categories of Dylan songs for me, and I'll tell you what sort of my favorite is in each. One is the common human experience thing, and a lot of those have to do with the boy-girl thing. Falling in love, having fights, falling out of love, a relationship breaks apart, whatever. And for me, you just cannot beat Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. I love that song. It's pretty straightforward. It's not difficult to understand what the meaning is or what's going on in the song. And if folks in the audience would like to hear it, that's one I could play. But the next category is the ballad type song. And he's got so many wonderful, you mentioned a couple of them there. But one that I find very special and just draws me in is Lily Rosemary and the Jack of Hearts.
Love that one.
I just think that's an extraordinary piece of music. It's just a wonderful achievement. And then the third category is where I'm not sure the song has any meaning, and I cannot give up the quest to figure out what it means, despite my colleague, the wonderful Dylanologist and distinguished historian Sean Wilentz, telling me, Robbie, it doesn't mean anything. You can give it up. And in that category, my absolute favorite is She Belongs to Me. Now, that's an obscure one. A lot of people don't know. Even Dylan fans don't know that song. But if you don't, please go and look up on YouTube, get a performance. It's mostly covered. Dylan recorded it at one point.
Love minus zero over no limit.
But there are several good covers of it as
called.
well. She Belongs to Me.
She's got everything she needs. She's an artist. She don't
look
back.
She can take the dark out of the nighttime, paint the daytime black. But if it does mean something, please will somebody tell me what it means to say, she's got an Egyptian ring, sparkles before she speaks. I've been working on that for about 40 years.
But don't you have an image of her?
I do.
You do?
Absolutely do. Absolutely do.
Well, thank you. This has been wonderful, and we could literally go on for hours. So we'll stop now. But we are going to have a performance now of a couple of Dylan songs.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Because Robert George, you're in a
And could I welcome to
the
stage? Are they
yes,
close by?
And thank you
Bronwyn,
all.
Yeah.
Oh.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So could I welcome Bronwyn McShay and Chanel Duke up to sing with me? There they are. Please, no one shout out Judas because I'm playing an electric guitar. It's a hollow body electric. That means it's semi-acoustic. Okay. So the folks who organized the meeting, to whom we're immensely grateful, asked us for a couple of songs in particular, and they are songs that are about freedom. So we're going to begin with Dylan's I Shall Be Released, and then move on to his Chimes of Freedom. So first, I Shall Be Released. And let me just say a word of introduction about Chanel and Bronwyn. Chanel Duke is the program administrator of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, so I have the pleasure of working with her daily. I'm the director of that program. And Bronwyn McShay is a postdoctoral fellow in the Madison program. She, like Richard, is a historian. They say everything can be replaced. They say every distance is not near. So I remember every face of every man who put me here. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, any day now, I shall be released.
They say every man needs protection. They say that every man must fall. But I swear I see my reflection somewhere so high above the wall.
I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, any day now, I shall be released.
Yonder stands a man in this lonely crowd, a man who swears he's not to blame. All day long I hear him crying so loud, calling out that he's been framed.
I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, any day now, I shall be released. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, any day now, I shall be released. I see my light come shining from the west down to the east. Any day now, any day now, I shall be released. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Far between sundown's finish and midnight's broken toll, we ducked inside the doorway, thunder crashing, as majestic bells and bolts struck shadows in the sounds, seeming to be the chimes of freedom flashing. Flashing for the warriors whose strength is not to fight. Flashing for the refugees on the unarmed road of flight. And for each and every underdog, soldier in the night, we gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. In the city's melted furnace, unexpectedly we watched, with faces hidden while the walls were tightening. As the echo of the wedding bells before the blowing rain dissolved into the bells of the lightning. Tolling for the rebel, tolling for the rake, tolling for the luckless, the abandoned and forsake, tolling for the outcast, burning constantly at stake. We gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. begging for the guardians and protectors of the mind, and the poet and the painter far behind his rightful time. We gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing in the wild cathedral evening. The rain unraveled tales for the disrobed, faceless forms of no position, tolling for the tongues with no place to bring their thoughts, all down in taken for granted situations, tolling for the deaf and blind, tolling for the mute, for the mistreated mateless mother, the mistitled prostitute, for the misdemeanor outlaw, chained and cheated by pursuit. We gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing.
Even though a cloud's white curtain in a far-off foreign flare, and the hypnotic splattered mist was slowly lifting, electric lights still struck like arrows, fired but for the ones condemned to drift or else be kept from drifting.
Tolling for the searching ones on their speechless seeking trail, for the lonesome-hearted lovers with too personal a tale, and for each unharmful gentle soul misplaced inside a jail. We gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing, starry-eyed and laughing, as I recall when we were caught, trapped by no track of ours, for they hang suspended. As we listened one last time, and we watched with one last look, spellbound and swallowed till the tolling ended. Tolling for the aching, whose wounds cannot be nursed, for the countless confused, accused, misused, strung out ones and worse, and for every hung-up person in the whole wide universe. We gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. We gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing.
Thanks very much.
Well, I know you would like to have another song, only hold on a second. You know, one of the issues with Bob Dylan songs is that usually they're composed of 25 verses. So we will play another song, a short one, or a reduction of it. Before that, since you're here, please, a round of applause, and let's thank again Richard, Robert, and Marie for their presentation. Thank you. And then, you know, what is left of the encounter? I mean, this adds to the magic of the encounter, the miracle of the encounter, I would say. At 3:15, as soon as the song is over, you will have a chance to meet another extraordinary human being, Sister Laura Girotto, who's rocking Ethiopia. And she'll be at the second floor auditorium as soon as the song is over. And then we'll meet again here. We have 2 more appointments here. At 4, A New Beginning, Life in the Aftermath of a Massacre, with testimonies from the Sandy Hook tragedy. And the final presentation here will be at 5:30, Born to Never Die, The Life of the Servant of God, Chiara Corbella, with Chiara's husband and Chiara's medical doctor. And remember that Richard is willing to sign his book on Bob Dylan as soon as this conference is over. Thanks again. See you later. What are you going to play, Robert?
It ain't me, babe.
Away from my window, leave at your own chosen speed. I'm not the one you want, babe. I'm not the one you need. You say you're looking for someone never weak, but always strong, to protect you and defend you, whether you are right or wrong. Someone to open each and every door, but it ain't me, babe. No, 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 it ain't me, babe. It ain't me you're looking for, babe. Go lightly from the ledge, babe. Go lightly on the ground. I'm not the one you want, babe. I'll only let you down. You say you're looking for someone who will promise never to part, someone to close her eyes for you, someone to close her heart, someone who'll die for you and more, but it ain't me, babe. No, 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 it ain't me, babe. It ain't me you're looking for, babe. Go melt back into the night, babe. Everything inside is made of stone. There's nothing here moving, and anyway, I'm not alone. You say you're looking for someone who'll pick you up every time you fall, to gather flowers constantly, and to come every time you call. A lover for your life and nothing more, but it ain't me, babe. No, 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 it ain't me, babe. It ain't me you're looking for, babe. No, 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 it ain't me, babe. It ain't me you're looking for.
Chanel Duke, Bronwyn McShay. Thanks, everyone.